Video is brought to you by MoviePalette.com and enter ROOM15 for 15% off of your palette. Hey horror fans, I am the Blood Guy. Welcome back to another review of a documentary on a serial killer. And yes, I know my eye's still a little messed up. I've been taking stuff for it. It's not really helping. So please just still bear with me through this. But this is a documentary that has been on my radar for quite some time because this is a case that I've been fascinated by for as long as I've been into serial killers. I mean, this is one of the first ones I actually heard about and really got into. Probably when I was in junior high. That was when early junior high. That was when I really started to get into the topic of serial killers. A movie about this one had just come out, so there was a lot of stuff on TV that was being shown and that I saw. So this is one of the first cases I got into. And I had never seen this documentary in its entirety. I had only seen clips, some of the archive footage that's in it. But it is one of my favorite cases, and I was really glad to see this and to finally see the sequel that came out 10 years later. But this is Aileen Wuornos, The Selling of a Serial Killer, the 1992 interviews. Which, it really should just be the 1992 interview, because they really only got to have one interview, and it's like the last 15 minutes of the film, which is an hour 28 minutes. But this is a very interesting one because this isn't your typical sort of textbook but on the screen type of documentary. You know, it doesn't go over her life and her crimes, how she got arrested, her trial. In fact, only 2 of the 3 trials had happened by the time this came out. While this was being filmed, they were actually getting ready for the 3rd and final trial. So that alone is pretty interesting. But instead, it's kind of this filmmaker's journey, directed by Nick Broomfield. Him pretty much making this documentary about the idea of all these people trying to cash in on the story and the name Aileen Wuornos. Now, through voiceover narration, we do get snippets of, pretty much a briefing throughout the film on who Aileen is, what her crimes were, what her childhood was like. But it really is just sort of this, it's almost like a student film where we just see Nick and I think just his DP, Barry Aykroyd. They're staying at the house of her adopted mother, who actually adopted her, I think, during her trial in 1991. They're staying with her until they get the okay to go visit her in prison. And as they try to get interviews with people in that area of Florida surrounding the case, people that knew Aileen or possibly some of the cops, until eventually Wuornos herself. And it's really interesting. You don't really get a lot of documentaries like this. They're usually, kind of your typical, this is who they are, this is what they did, this is where they come from, this is where they are or were. So it's not really like that. It really doesn't focus on the crimes. I mean, it mentions them, obviously, but it's very intimate as far as just, these interviews with people that knew her, like this one guy, Dick Mills, that lived with her for like a week, I think right just prior to her arrest. A bartender at the Last Chance bar where she was arrested. Only one officer that actually would interview them, because the whole documentary is about how some of the police might have tried to sell her story before anything serious really happened, like before a trial. How, maybe her lover, Tyria Moore, Ty, might have tried to sell her story before anything really happened. All the way up to Aileen pretty much stating that she feels her adopted mother and her lawyer, Steve Glazer, might be trying to use her to get her story. Because it goes into how she pled no contest, and she blames them. So it's very interesting. It's really just this sort of more so a documentary as what's going on now with Aileen, but also just this one aspect that you don't really see a whole lot of documentaries about, which is, I think the original tagline was monster or commodity. So it is very interesting, but I do have the 2002 sequel, The Life and Death of a Serial Killer, and this is another one I haven't seen in its entirety. I've only seen some of the interviews on YouTube, which, yes, this does have the one, everyone knows, where, like, her eyes are big, she's going crazy, talking about the systematic torture of the prison. I think this one might be a bit more of an actual, like, documentary, like, about her life and crimes. But in any case, this is still a great watch. Yeah, you don't get to see Aileen, as far as interviews go until, like, the last 10-15 minutes. It is more so everyone else, but there's a ton of archive footage in here. From her initial confession on January 16th of 91 to, a lot of stuff from her hearings and her trial. So you do get a lot of stuff in this, and it's still a great watch. Now, one thing is, it does have a lot to say about, America's first female serial killer, which, of course, that's not true. Technically, there were a number of female serial killers before her. Jane Toppan, Nandy Doss, Belle Gunness, Dr. Hazard. But, of course, and then ones that were married to killers and participated, like, actually, a lot of them were British, like Rosemary West, Myra Hindley. But I do think maybe Aileen was the first female serial killer to not really kill in her profession. Well, technically that's not true because she was a prostitute. But to sort of kill more or less out of cold blood. I mean, she robbed her victims as well. But I guess to be the serial killer in the context of like a modern day, like all the other ones. Whereas before, they seem to be these like serial poisoners, which technically she's not. Maybe she's just the first female serial killer to get the notoriety of like a Bundy or a Dahmer. I mean, everywhere you look. I mean, which I also have her autobiography, Monster, which is great. She has another book called Dear Dawn, which I think is just a bunch of letters, which I would love to get, but this makes a great pair. I mean, this is probably my favorite based on a serial killer film, both in just quality and of accuracy. Charlize Theron's performance is great. But the point I was going to make is, any book about female serial killers, she's on the cover. She's the one that's listed on the back. She's the major article in all of them. So maybe she's just the first to attract that kind of attention and notoriety. And the film, I think, kind of touches on that. There is even a quote. There's some hearing that Aileen goes into talking about, how movie deals have already been made and defamation. She talks about the earlier TV movie Overkill, which I have not seen, but it's on YouTube, so I'll definitely be checking that out. Starring one of the Sex and the City girls as Aileen. And how that got everything wrong. And she even mentions how, like, the papers and tabloids, she says, make me out to be like a Jeff Dahmer, which I'm not. So, yeah, maybe she's just the first female serial killer. I know I keep touching my eye and I shouldn't. But I think she's the first to get that kind of notoriety. But and I didn't even pull any of like the big encyclopedias that I always have. I have close to 24 of them, and she's in every single one. Or she's even on the cover of about half of them. So I mean, she's a very notorious killer. And I mean, maybe it's also because she's female. So I think that's what they mean by first American female serial killer. but the film kind of touches on that. And so, no, it's not a documentary about her life and her crimes or like the psychological aspect or anything like that. It really is just kind of takes place, I think, over like a week or 2 weeks or so, about, you know, Nick Broomfield trying to get in to get this interview with Aileen Wuornos, but also just trying to get this story about how everyone around her is just trying to use her to sell her story and to make money off of her. But also to kind of look at her trial, how maybe she was kind of coerced by certain people to plead a certain way, no contest, or how some of the evidence was thrown out or not used, and that's how she was able to get, at the time of this, 4 death sentences. So that's what it's more about. Everyone using her to try to sell a story, how she might have had an unfair trial, how she was coerced to plead a certain way. But it's still a very good watch. And yeah, you might only get one short interview at the end, but it's still definitely worth the watch. I mean, even all the archive footage alone is definitely worth it. So I really enjoyed it. Definitely looking forward to checking out the 2002 film, which I think I've seen some of the interviews, but I haven't really seen any of the context around it as far as the documentary goes. But this is still a very good watch, especially if you're really into the Wuornos story. Those two would go great together. Of course, these two. It's a very fascinating story, so definitely check that out. So with that, I guess I'll get into the brief summary and then just the sort of the vague list of things that the film covers. So as always, I like to give a brief summary on the killer that the film or documentary is based on. So Aileen Wuornos, often considered the America's first serial killer, killed 7 men in Florida between 1989 and 1990. It was arrested on January 9th, 1991, and confessed on the 16th. She was a drifting prostitute who would get picked up by male clients. Then when in a secluded spot, she would shoot them to death and rob them. At least one was an officer and another was an elderly man just giving her a ride. She claimed all murders were in self-defense of sexual assault, though the only likely case would be that of her first victim, Richard Mallory, who was a convicted rapist. Before and during her murder spree, she lived out of seedy motels with her lover of 5 years, Tyria Ty Moore, who would work with police and eventually turn Aileen over to them. Over 3 trials, Aileen was found guilty and sentenced to death for 6 of the murders. She would also be infamous for her vulgar outbursts in the courtroom after her sentencings. During her stay in prison, she would go back and forth on her claims of self-defense and her guilt. Wuornos also made paranoid claims of the cops knowing what she was doing all along, and the prison guards systematically torturing her. She was finally executed by lethal injection on October 9th, 2002, at the age of 46. While she may technically not be the first American female serial killer, she is certainly the most notorious, with many books, documentaries, and movies have been made about her and her story, including the 2003 Oscar-winning film Monster. And so now we just get into the vague list of topics or things that the film covers. Nick Broomfield, the director, and I don't really want to say the host, but the guy doing all the talking and the one that we see, the one conducting all the interviews. Over voiceover, he sort of briefs us on who Aileen was. He mentions, between 89 and 91, she killed 7 men. There's news footage of, news anchors talking about the Florida Angels of Death with the 2 composite sketches of Lee and Ty, which is kind of funny because I think a lot of people are thinking maybe she was the first female serial killer that wasn't like a nurse or a doctor, but then they give her a moniker Angel of Death, which is usually associated with nurse and doctor killers. So Uh, then we and how she was arrested at the Last Resort Bar. I said Last Chance earlier. I don't know why, but Last Resort Bar. Uh, and then we get archive footage of the interrogation room of her initial confession on October 16th of 91. So then we're introduced to Steve Glazer, who is her lawyer, and her adopted mother, Arlene Prowley, which she adopted Aileen sometime in 91. And Nick and his director of photography, I think they're staying with Arlene throughout all of this, or at the very least coming and going whenever they want. Because Arlene and Steve are able to get through to Aileen, although they say that Aileen hasn't spoken to them in about a month, because that was the last sentencing of the second trial, where she got her second, third, and fourth death sentence, because she pled no contest because they wanted her to. So, they're always at Arlene's house and, kind of waiting on the okay to go see her. And Arlene talks about how she came to know Aileen, how and why she adopted her. Steve talks about how, he came to represent Aileen. Side note, Steve Glazer is actually a hell of a musician. We hear him play guitar and sing several songs, like, on camera, but then we hear some recordings of stuff he's done. And there was a recording of him doing the song Time by Pink Floyd, which I've always been a huge Floyd fan. And before it got to the vocals, I thought, wow, his guitar playing sounds a lot like David Gilmour. And then he started singing, and I was like, oh, that is a Pink Floyd song. And he actually sings it pretty well, too. So he's a good singer and a good guitar player. Maybe not the best lawyer. But yeah, they go into their relationships with Aileen, how they came to know her, the relationship since. Through voiceover, we get kind of a brief history of her childhood, which actually we get that a couple times throughout the film. Nick goes to the Last Resort Bar, talks to the bartender. We get an interview with Dick Mills, who is a friend of Eileen's. They lived together for like a week at one point. There was some article that was written about their sex life together that was pretty salacious. He wanted to correct that, so they go into that. Footage of her on the stand on the trial for the murder of Richard Mallory. We get almost her whole testimony of, according to her, what Mallory did to her. And then we get her sentencing for that. We hear how she hired Steve Glazer as her lawyer. How we see archive footage of the sentencing for the next three murders at the second trial. This is the famous footage, where she says, "I hope all your children get in the." And then, she walks by the judge, is like, "You motherfucker." So, has that footage in there. He goes to visit Aileen, but then they're told that she refused. We get a tour of the Florida death house. We see the chair. They tell us how the chair works. Because at the time, she was sentenced to the chair. But then, over time, it became a lethal injection. So, at the time of this, she was sentenced to the chair. Steve goes to visit Aileen to see what her plea is in the upcoming trial, and tries to see if he could talk her into seeing Nick. She agrees to see Nick, and he pays Steve and Arlene. They sign the contract. He does bring up the son of Sam Law, because Nick mentioned several times, due to the son of Sam Law, how can Aileen profit from this? Because for those that don't know, after David Berkowitz was sentenced in 1978, there was what was called the Son of Sam Law, which is that prisoners cannot profit off of any movie or book deals. But he does mention that law is no longer in effect. Now, I don't know if that's countrywide or if it goes state to state. I'm pretty sure it just goes state to state. We get an interview with Joseph Michael Reynolds, who's the author of Dead Ends, which is a book on Wuornos. We get footage of Wuornos at this other hearing where she talks about the TV movie Overkill and other, tabloids and articles, making her out to be the monster. It mentions, some of the seedy work about a lot of the police, talking to people about movie and book deals before a trial had ever even happened, and how Nick says how none of them will talk to him and bar him from the building. Except for one sergeant, Brian Jarvis, who agrees to give an interview, and he talks about a lot of the crap that he went through when, he found out about cops talking about movie and book deals. Also, talking about Ty's involvement with some of the book deals. Footage of Ty on the stand, and also the tape of the recorded phone call between Lee and Ty right before her arrest, which, if you've seen Monster, you know that phone call. Nick finally gets to see Aileen and gets his interview, and she discusses, apprehension of Steve and Arlene, which at one point in the film, there's a falling out between Nick and Arlene. This kind of towards the end, where, it sort of talks about money and her not wanting to talk on camera anymore. At least not without the presence of Steve Glazer. But she discusses her apprehension of Steve and Arlene. And then goes on her typical tirade of, crooked cops in the area, knowing what she was doing, her botched trial. And talks a little bit about Ty. And then it ends with footage of the press conference dealing with the resignation of Major Dan Henry after his bugged phone call talking about a movie deal. And it ends with the voiceover saying about the possible outcome of Eileen's trial if any police made money off of her story. So, yeah. I mean, it's not one of those documentaries that covers the life of Aileen Wuornos, so there's not a whole lot of different topics. I just kind of made those just so you would kind of know what's in it. But yeah, it's not like it has all these life events that it covers. It really is just sort of this short period where the filmmakers are kind of waiting around to be able to talk to her and just interviewing other people in the area or people that were involved with the case with the topic of the selling of a serial killer. People wanting to automatically, just cash in on her story, whether they were cops that worked on the case or their friends or loved ones or even a lawyer, possibly just trying to get her to plead no contest, which Aileen even goes into why Arlene told her to, plead no contest or guilty. So, I'll let you watch it to figure that out. But it's still a very interesting watch. Again, even the archive footage alone is very worth it. So, definitely glad I checked this out. Glad I own it. I've been wanting to see it for quite some time. Of course, I've seen a lot of the archive footage, but a lot of it I haven't. So, I'm really excited to check this one out. Because, like I said, I think this one is more of your typical kind of documentary, but with maybe more interviews and more of an update, since 1992. And this came out right on the heels of Monster. I think it came out right before Monster, actually. But yeah, definitely one of my favorite cases, one of the first cases I ever got into and really studied, watched, or read about. So, if you're into the Wuornos case, this is definitely something to check out, along with the 2002 sequel. I will be reviewing that. I will be checking out the TV film Overkill at some point, so stay tuned for those, and thank you for watching.